So good morning again. I think we'll start now. Stephanie, Kirsten, Carsten, and I are very happy to see you all. Today we have another round of Impulse Stiften, our philanthropy roundtable. Today in English because we have a guest from the UK who speaks and understands a little bit of German, but will stay in English today. Just a quick reminder in the beginning on our ground rules, please mute your microphones. You're more than happy and welcome to turn your cameras on so that Caroline and I can talk to actual people and not to a dark screen. As always, ask all your questions and comments in the chat. And as you already noticed, we always record our sessions so that everybody who is not present today can actually join in the conversation and watch the video later on in our website. Today, we are more than happy to welcome Caroline Fiennes from the UK. She's the founder and director of Giving Evidence, and her mission basically is to encourage and enable charitable giving based on sound evidence. And she uses her roles as a speaker, an author, as well as a researcher and a consultant just to do that. And I've been following her work for many years now, so I'm really excited that she joins us today, and then that we can have a conversation about evidence and about foundations today. I highly recommend her book. That she published 10 years ago, I think. You wrote about that a couple of days on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
10 years ago, she wrote a book. It's called "It Ain't What You Give, It's the Way That You Give It." And I highly recommend reading that and all her articles. Always helpful answers to some of the fundamental questions of giving and philanthropy. Today, we are going to touch on two different topics. In the first part, we talk about Caroline's experiences and views on the role of evidence in giving. Basically, what is evidence? What kinds of evidence are there? And how can we, as grant makers, actually use evidence in our day-to-day work? And in the second part, we'll talk about the foundation practice rating, which was published a couple of weeks ago. And Caroline actually did the research for the rating, which looks at the issues of diversity, transparency, and accountability in UK foundations. And we'll discuss the results and find out what we as German-speaking funders can learn from the rating. So, good morning, Caroline.
Hi, really nice to meet you. What a lot of people.
Yeah. As I said, we've been working on this call for quite some time, and over the time we actually got quite some audience. So I'm very happy to introduce you. And maybe before we delve into the issues I just outlined, maybe you can talk a little bit about yourself and how actually like evidence in giving became your thing, your focus in your work. I know that you had different roles in the charity sector over the years as a staffer, researcher, volunteer, trustee, chief executive, but how did actually end up being evidence that's so important to your career?
Yeah, so I have a background in physics and science, and so that's it. That's the answer. You know, it's that you know, I just take a scientific approach. One thing that you really learn in physics is that things are not always the way that they seem. So if we just look with our eyes, then often we get it wrong because nature can deceive us. And so when I started working in this sector, in the charity sector, then I was just really interested in what is really actually going on, and looking in a more scientific way, a more data-driven way, a more empirical way than just looking to see, you know, what we can see with our eyes. And so quite a lot of what we do is about getting data. Some of it is about experiments. It's basically about applying the scientific method to giving and to understanding social issues.
And I think it's always connected to kind of also like a deep understanding of this charity sector and how it actually works in the end. And that's why.
Yeah, so I've been in this sector for a long time, I guess as a volunteer, and then also I started working in this sector very sort of more or less full time more than 20 years ago. It's actually the day before 9/11. Many of you will remember that Monday. And so, yeah, so looking at foundations that were trying to improve their effectiveness. And so I advised donors and funders of many descriptions about that. And then I ran a charity as a chief executive. And that's when I decided to write a book, because I realized that many donors and foundations are much less helpful than they think they are. And the reasons that they are less helpful, I think, is because they just don't realize exactly how charities and nonprofits actually work. So, for example, I think it can sound like a good idea to be sure that a nonprofit is using your money in a particular way. But actually, if you are a charity and you have 50 restricted grants, it's a complete nightmare. And people who work in business have never seen a set of accounts where the customer tells you what you have to do with the revenue, right? It's just not something that happens in business. And so I just wanted basically to explain to donors some of what is actually going on inside organizations and how those pressures kind of work out. So the book is basically about it's about three things: how you can find a great organization, like how you identify them, how you help them, and how you cannot hinder them, how to not get in the way. So that's it. And then the book came out, as you say, 10 years ago last week. And I was not expecting this, but then it kind of turned into this organization, because then people started calling up and asking for advice on various things. So we do advice for donors of various types. Sometimes that is literally, who do I give my money to? Sometimes it's strategy reviews or strategy design or program design or so on. And then we also do what I call commissioned research, which I expect we'll talk about, is that we do commissioned research. So, for example, into what is the evidence base in a sector? Where are there gaps in it, for example, or the rating that Felix talked about, or we did this analysis a couple of years ago about the royal family in the UK, who are patrons of lots of charities, and we looked at what is that and does it help. So we do commissioned research as well.
Yeah. So probably to start our conversation, maybe you could talk a little bit about what actually is evidence and what kinds of evidence are important to grant making, if you say your mission is to do grant making and philanthropy based on sound evidence. So what's your perspective on that? What kinds of evidence you're looking at?
So it's several things. So often when you say evidence, people immediately assume that you are talking about randomized controlled trials. And I am talking about randomized controlled trials, but I'm not only talking about them. So it's important to understand where the problem is that you're trying to solve, why it is there, and who else is doing what about it. So it's also important to understand if it actually is a problem. So we did a study for some Dutch donors who were interested in supporting girls' education in various countries, including Indonesia, because they thought that girls' education there would need some improvement. And we looked and we found that actually the girls' in participation in education in Indonesia and their attainment, so what they achieve, is exactly the same as boys. In fact, it's slightly better than boys. Okay. But both girls and boys are miles below the OECD average. Okay. So the problem in Indonesia is not girls' education. The problem in Indonesia is education in general. So that, you know, there's no RCTs there. That's just data that's gathered by the OECD. That took us about 2 hours to work that out. And then, you know, this problem, we could reframe or change the problem that donor was looking to work on. So it's important to understand what the problem is, where it is, and why it arises, and who's doing what about it, so what the gaps are. And then once you have all that, then it's important to understand what is effective at addressing it. And so there we use the rigorous existing evidence. So we are talking about randomized control trials, and I'm not going to apologize for talking about them and for being a fan of them.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about what randomized control trials are, because I think it's always a good moment to actually be a bit more precise of that, because actually not all grant makers actually use those kinds of trials or are able to read those kinds of trials. So I think it's probably one thing I understood is that you, for example, like in the case of Indonesia, you look at public available data on education, for example, and then
so in a randomized trial, here I'm going to show you an example. So in a randomized, so the purpose is to identify what is the difference that this program makes. So the question of what is your impact, what is the impact of your program, is always, it's the same question as what happens with, can you see this now?
I think now we can see it.
So what happens, the impact of your program is the difference between what happens in the world where your program happens versus the world where your program does not happen. Okay. And so one way, a good way of finding that out is to have a situation where the program happens and the program does not happen. And so you can compare the results in those two cases. Okay. But you can't just say, okay, we're going to look at people who, so there was an Australian example of a back to work program to help women back into work. And they got, I don't know, so women would come to them and they would help them. And let's say 40% of women who came to them would get a job in 6 weeks or something. And they said, okay, and if you look at the register of all unemployed women in Australia, maybe only 25% of them get a job within 6 weeks. So they said, so our impact is that increase from 40% to 25%. That's not true, right? Because maybe the women who come to your program are the women who are most motivated or most organized or whatever. Like there's some important difference in the people who choose to come to your program. It's called a selection effect. And it's different from what we call the treatment effect, which is the effect that the actual program has. And you find this all the time in impact research that is done by nonprofits and others, is that what they are claiming is their impact is actually a mix of the selection effect and the treatment effect. And a randomized control trial is just a way of getting rid of that. So you know that the two groups who get the program and who don't get the program are pretty much the same. So you take some people who are basically the same, this group here on the left, and you divide them randomly into two groups. And so then you're pretty sure the two groups are the same. And one group, they get the program, and one group, they don't. Okay, so then the group that does not get the program is called the control group. Okay, not because we control them, it's nothing to do with being controlliert, it's just a word that we're using. So it's a control group, and the only difference then between those two groups is one got the program and one didn't. So then you can look at the difference in the outcomes. So this example is from a back to work program. So here the top group get the program and the bottom group is the control group and they don't. And then you can see at the end, the green people are the ones that found work. And in the top group, 4 of them got work. And in the bottom group, 2 of them got work. Okay, we're going to pretend these are 2,000 people, okay, because otherwise this study would be too small. And so that tells you what the difference is that the program made. You can be pretty confident that the difference there was due to your program and it wasn't due to just the selection effect. That's what a randomized control is. That's it. Okay, so sometimes you may be aware that people get very excited and they get a bit shouty about randomized control trials, and I don't really know why. I mean, they are a big threat in some ways. A rigorous evaluation is a big threat sometimes to a nonprofit, precisely because a rigorous evaluation will find what the effect of your program actually is. And so it means that you can't just bullshit anymore, basically. You can't claim that your impact is much higher than it really is, okay? So here's an example from South Africa, which I really like, which is from a remedial, which is from an education program. Can you see this now?
Mm-hmm. We can.
So the 2 graphs on the left are children who got the reading program, and the first bar is how good their reading was before they got the program, and the second bar is how good they were afterwards at reading, like I think it was 10 weeks later or something. So you can see that their reading improves, right, with the program. So it would be quite easy to think that, okay, it's the program that has produced that difference. But when somebody did a randomized control trial, and i.e. they had an equivalent group of children who didn't get the program, you can see that they improved by basically the same amount, right? And this is because children learn things whether you teach them or not. So, and the reason this is so important is because if you only saw those 2 bars on the left, if you only see the results that a charity might give you of its program, then you might be fooled into thinking that this program had improved their reading. Well, actually it hadn't. Actually, it had done basically nothing. And so you might waste your money. And obviously in philanthropy, there is, you know, this much money and massive amounts of need all the time. So we are allocating scarce money. We do not have enough money. So we have to be very careful what we give it to. So it's really important to understand that we are solving a problem that really exists. It's not like the Indonesia girls education thing, and that we are solving it with some program that actually is effective.
I asked that question about and asked you to talk a bit about the randomized control trials, because I think when you start to talk about that, you very easily recognize that then it's going to be pretty complicated at a certain point, because there are a lot of scientific methods to do around that. Do you actually think that for smaller and medium-sized funders, it's actually feasible to ask charities for randomized control trials?
No. So I think that most charities should not, most nonprofits should not produce research, but rather they should use existing research. So in order to do a randomized trial, or in fact any rigorous evaluation of any method, you have to have enough people. Your program has to be big enough. And most programs that are run by nonprofits are not big enough. Okay. So actually nonprofits often, they do not have the skills to do social science research. Why would they have skills to do social science research? They run a domestic violence refuge, or they deal with refugees or something. So they don't have the skills to do it. They often don't have the money to do it. They don't have the right incentive to do it, because a rigorous study will tell you what your impact actually is. And so it means that you cannot bullshit anymore. And often your impact will be less than you think it is, to be honest. But fourth, even if you can cure all of those, which kind of money sort of can cure those, often most nonprofits, their programs are too small. So we saw this, the UK Interior Ministry does some evaluation of programs to reduce criminal behavior, reoffending. And when it looks at nonprofits, I think it found that 67% of programs run by nonprofits are too small to produce rigorous evaluations. Okay, you just can't do it. So it seems to me that for most nonprofits and most funders should use the existing research. They don't need, in my view, they don't need to be producing more research. So we spend a lot of time, I'm going to show you a picture of that, here it is. So we spend a lot of time.
Caroline, because I think that's a really important point, because I see that there are quite a few questions around randomized control trials in the chat, but I'd rather focus more on the ways grant makers can use research, not how to do better RCTs. That's a different interesting question, but I think you just made the point that if we can't ask single charities to produce research or to show with an RCT that their program does make a difference, what do we do now as a grant maker? What's the strategy? And you basically said, and that's probably one of the examples you can talk about, is that it's important for a grant maker to actually get an understanding on what evidence is out there on the field you're working in, not on the specific intervention, but on the field. And a couple of years ago, you did a research, like a systematic review on the outcomes, both short-term and long-term, on outdoor adventure programs. And that, to translate it into German, would be like Kinder- und Jugendarbeit, Ferienprogramme. And I think that's a good example, because that's very similar to what a lot of the funders in this call actually do in their day-to-day operations. So how does a systematic review like that look like, and what can you actually learn from that for your grant making strategy?
Yeah, this is a really, really important point. And if you only remember one thing from today, I would love you to remember this, which is about using the existing evidence. It means that you have to go into the academic literature and read it and see what it says, or find somebody to do that for you. We do this sometimes for foundations. So I'm going to talk about some work that we have done in, I'm actually not going to talk about the outdoor learning thing. A better example is some stuff we did in child abuse, so Kindermissbrauch, and Misshandlung. So we worked for a foundation, Porticus, who you may know, they fund in many countries, including Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And they wanted their work to be based on better evidence. And so the first question is, okay, where is there evidence? Like what has been studied? And so particularly on this issue of what works. So we did a big search in the whole area of child abuse. So all types of abuse, physical, mental, sexual, psychological, everything, and globally, and in institutions, so schools, hospitals, sports clubs, churches, everything. We did a massive search, and then we drew a map of it to show where there is evidence and where there is not evidence yet. And this, I'm going to show you what we found. You can't read this because it's too small, but I can explain it to you. So the rows here, this is called an evidence and gap map, okay? Because it shows you where there is evidence and where there is not. The rows are the interventions. So there's a row on prevention, encouraging disclosure, on response, and on treatment. And these columns are on outcomes. So whether an organization has a safeguarding policy, or child mental health outcomes, or child physical health outcomes, for example. So you might need to translate some of this if people won't understand. And as you can, so this shows us where, so each of these blocks in the middle is a study. And you can see that there's a whole area here on the right, which have basically no studies, okay? And also that row at the bottom, which is about treatment, how do we treat victims of child abuse? There's hardly any studies, right? And that is actually only 2 studies in there, and they're both 20 years old. Whereas at the top, almost all the studies in this area are about prevention. They're all in the row at the top. And there's that one block in the middle with loads of studies. It has like 50 studies. And they are all about programs in school to help children know what abuse is and how not to be abused. Okay. So one thing this tells you is that if you have, and this funder does have programs which do this one thing up here, which has been really well studied, okay? So we can read those studies and see what they say. And they basically all say the same thing, which is that those programs work. They don't have a massive effect, but they do basically work, and they've been done in loads of different settings, so types of school, different ages of children, different design of the program. They basically all work, okay? So what that means is you can just implement that program, okay? Like design one that is not crazy, design one that is kind of similar to the ones that we already have, and then we can just get on with it and implement it, right? It's a bit like when you get the COVID vaccine now. You know, the trials have all happened. We know the effect of the Pfizer vaccine, and now we just get on with it, right? Everybody, like we're not all doing trials all the time. By contrast, if you are interested in treating victims, there is basically no evidence for you to stand on. So you will have to commission some more research, and that could be from the nonprofit that you are funding, or better might be to work with some academics to make sure that you get a group that is big enough. Okay. So for example, in the UK, I don't know if you have this, well, your school start earlier. So here, school starts at 9 o'clock, usually, or 8:30. 8:30. And so some children come to school hungry, they don't have breakfast at home. So we have breakfast clubs in schools, and because children cannot learn if they are hungry. And they sound like a really great idea. And when somebody wanted to do a proper evaluation of them, they had to get 168 schools into a randomized trial in order for the trial to be big enough to be statistically robust. Okay. And no breakfast club runs in 168 schools. Okay, they're just not that big. They're usually in like 5 or 1. So they had to get loads of breakfast clubs together into the trial. Do you see what I mean? So you cannot ask your grantee to produce the evidence to evaluate it. It's also kind of weird, I think, to expect that you could produce, you could ask the grantee to evaluate itself, because, you know, obviously it has like an incentive to show its results as more favorable.
So the takeaway would be is you definitely have to have an understanding as a grant maker what evidence is actually out there in your field. Yes. And a structured way to do that would be like the evidence map you just showed us. Yes. But I guess there are at certain points more informal ways to do that, but you definitely have to have an understanding of on your field and the research in the field, and that's probably rather a question you could ask some of your grantees is, so what research is out there? What research do you actually use? And on what program design is based in a way. So that would be kind of a one strategy to do that.
Yeah.
But basically, when you're in, and then there are certain areas where you have quite a lot of evidence, and then actually also on the programs, and then you can actually use that and do similar programs like that, or say, my breakfast club is similar to this breakfast club in this study, so it's rather likely that it works. Yeah, in a way, you can prove that for the single program, but you can say it's likely. What other strategies are there in areas where there's little evidence? Yeah, you said one is to produce evidence, but isn't it, for example, also a good way to work with charities that also have kind of experience in those areas to see what kind of knowledge they have from the practical perspective? Because I guess it's not feasible for all grant makers, especially medium-sized grant makers, to produce or to commission research in areas where there's little evidence.
Yeah, so well, this raises lots of issues. I mean, the first thing that you can do is to look at, to see whether evidence exists in the areas in which you fund. Okay, so then you can just, you know, stand on top of that evidence, and you don't have to commission anything. You can just use what already exists. So in my example, if you want to fund those programs that operate in schools to teach children about abuse, then you can just do it. Basically, they're kind of fine. You don't need to commission anything. I'm going to show you my kind of, this is how I think about it, is that if you have a problem or an outcome that you want to solve, then you have a question about, does the human race know how to solve that problem? You know, is there decent evidence about how to achieve that? And I know somebody's asked a question in the chat about the quality of an RCT. We can maybe get to that. By the way, it's when I'm talking, I can't read at the same time, so I'm only half seeing your questions. So is there decent evidence about how to achieve your outcome? If there is decent evidence and we know how to do it, then you can just get on with it. You can just use that evidence. You can just do what we might call evidence-based giving. Okay, so for example, if you want to reduce malaria, we know that anti-malaria bed nets are really effective. So off you go. Like, just go fund them, do them. I mean, obviously in areas that have got malaria, don't do it in Scotland. So there we are, then you're done. But if you are in this category here of no, we don't know, well, then I think you've got three choices. One is that, there isn't solid research here for you to stand on. So either you fund the production of some research, and that might be, like we've said, it would be, there's no point funding bad research that doesn't really tell you the answer. Like you should only fund the production of rigorous research, because otherwise it doesn't basically help. So that's likely to involve not necessarily academics, but professional researchers, expert researchers who can really answer the question and have a big enough sample size and so on. If you can't do that, I think then your only other real option is to do something else. It's like, go back to the beginning and find another target problem where there is some research. Okay, so when I have sometimes worked with donors who say, I'm never going to fund research ever, right? If there's not research, because my board or whatever are never going to do that. So if there's not anything to stand on, then you just need to go find a different question. The only alternative that you have is to guess and hope, right? And I put a casino wheel here because otherwise, if there isn't any research and so we don't know what works, and we're not going to fund the production of research to find out, then all you're doing is, non-profits come to you with some proposal which might sound okay, but it might be like that South African education example I talked about, the reading thing, where it seems okay, but in fact, we don't really know if it's okay or not. We've kind of no idea, right? Maybe this program is producing nothing, or maybe it's even harmful, right? So there's plenty of examples of programs in the social sector which are harmful, okay? And so, I mean, actually in child abuse, we didn't find any that are harmful, but like, God forbid that we should make a terrible situation like this worse, right? There was an education program that was run in the UK, and there was an evaluation quite recently, and it showed that it was only trying to teach children to read, and it was harmful, right? That it was rubbish, and it made children worse. And the more they ran the program, the worse it got. The better implemented the program was, the worse the outcomes were. Okay, and this program was designed by people who really know what they're doing. So we just have, this is why, so we just have to be extremely careful. So to answer your question, I do not think that you should ask the charities that you're funding to produce rigorous evidence, because they're just the wrong people to do it. The first thing is to go and look and see whether what I call the cupboard of human knowledge, you know, what is there in the cupboard? And the cupboard, some parts of it are really well organized. Somebody's put a link here to the evidence and gap maps on international development with Campbell. That part of the cupboard is really organized. Some is very disorganized, and you might have to hire somebody to sort through it and find what you need. But honestly, I think that if you don't use the existing research, the big danger is that you fund things that are pointless and you're wasting your money.
I think that's a very short and good answer on why to actually use evidence. And I think we already got into on the many difficulties how to actually use it in a way, like for example, because there are a lot of smaller kind of funders also working on domestic issues, local issues in Germany, and I think there's a big difference in the global south and in the development field. There are a lot of I think that they're more like you said, the cupboard is filled a little bit more and organized a little bit better, and that's why I reference, and I'll put a link to it in the chat, the work on those auto adventure programs, because that's a local issue, and that's kind of a soft issue in a way. Lots of smaller funders working on those issues, but maybe you can give another example on how to actually work with the situation that there's sometimes little evidence used. You worked a little bit with a Tiny Bean Fund.
Yeah.
And I think they developed quite a few ways on actually. They're also a smaller funder and not a big funder like Pork Decos, to help grantees actually use evidence and not particularly produce evidence, but how to help grantees to use evidence better. They have a fellowship program, as I understand it.
Yeah. Okay,
smaller
so
grants. Maybe you can talk about that, because that's an area like medium-sized grant makers could help their grantees.
Yeah. Okay, good. So ich liebe diese Beispiele. So a Tiny Bean Fund is basically a lady called Dr. Carmen Lee, and she used to be a librarian. She used to work she has a PhD, like a doctorate in library studies from Cambridge, and she worked in the library at Harvard. So she really understands about information being organized. And she works in the area of factory farming. I don't know what you call that. She was very aware that in that area, there are lots of non-profits doing things, but there is not very much evidence, and the evidence is the cupboard is quite disorganized. It's quite hard to find. So, and there's lots of gaps. And so we did a few things with her. One is that we talked to loads of people in that area to identify the most important, the priority unanswered questions. And so we came up with a prioritized list of unanswered questions. Okay. And then Tiny Bean Fund, her foundation, put out a request for proposals, an offer to academics to fund them to produce research to answer those questions. Okay, it's called the Burning Questions Initiative. So burning question is like an important question. And she's now funded, I think, 20 or something researchers to answer those in questions that the sector thinks are really important. And the questions were quite different to what we would have guessed. Some of them were about what works. So how do we encourage people to eat less meat? How do we, But some were about understanding the issue. So, you know, what is the amount of chickens that are produced in China, for example? You know, massive growth in the number of cows in China, which is mainly for milk for pizzas. I thought that was really funny. So we did that, and then we also designed with her and created a program to get academics and professional researchers to work more closely with nonprofits. So this is about helping nonprofits to find and use the research that already exists. So sometimes they are, the nonprofit has an academic who goes there for, you know, one day a week for 6 months, for example, or they might go for a kind of period of 1 month, where you just need to sort of borrow an academic, right? So there was an organization which was designing its new Asia strategy because they were just starting work in Asia, and they wanted to build their Asia strategy based on the research that already existed. So they could kind of borrow an academic for a month who understands that information, and they could use them. So I think this is an amazing example that I've never seen an example like it. And I think it works partly because Carmen has come from the academic world, and so she really understands that. So yeah, I mean, anybody could do that. I think in lots of sectors, it would be really useful to have much closer relationships between the academics and the practitioners. You talked about the outdoor learning, and one thing that we found in outdoor learning, it was quite funny, was we brought together funders and academics and practitioners, and they just didn't know each other. So one of the effects of our program is that then they all knew each other, these 3 groups, and they formed a kind of committee thing, which carried on, and it still exists, I think, like 5 years later. And it helps to make sure that the academic research is answering questions that practitioners really have.
Yeah, thank you very much for that insight. I'm going to try to wrap up the part on evidence with one last question. Lots of interesting questions in the chat, but maybe one question going back to the why question, and also how question a colleague of ours asks. Basically, my way of saying is why should we hire expensive consultants and researchers, and why not just ask the people who actually need help, and ask the grantees what is needed, because there's a lot of kind of local knowledge, like in participation. What would be your view on that?
Both. I think it's really important to ask people, but it's also important to do the science. Okay, so if I ask you, how good is your COVID vaccine, right? Probably you don't know, actually, because either you got ill.
I'm sure that I don't know.
Yeah, so because, I mean, leave aside, never mind all the controversy, but maybe you have had COVID and been in hospital since then, or maybe you haven't, but you don't know why. And the purpose of the value of the scientific method is that it does tell us why, right? And so, for example, if you read the book about the Oxford vaccine, which is completely brilliant and you should read it, you know, there was somebody in the trial who got the vaccine and the next day they got hit by lightning. Okay, but they have no idea whether that was to do with the vaccine. It's only because there were 100,000 people in the trial that we know that it's nothing to do with the vaccine. Right? But so if you ask people, they cannot reliably tell you what works. Okay, because we are all ants and we cannot see the mountain, right? But it is really, really important to talk to people. So that stuff I said at the beginning about what is the problem, where is the problem, why is it there, who else is doing what, that is really important. So it's really important to know that, you know, maybe when you went to get your vaccine, it was a really horrible experience, and maybe you had to wait for 10 hours, and maybe they did it really badly and it really hurt and there was no toilet or something, you know, and so this would discourage people from going to get their vaccine. This is really important information, right? That really tells you how to run this program, and it can tell you, or you know, you talk to people, and somebody mentioned about low-income countries, that you know, you will find out a lot about corruption, for example. You will find out a lot about you know, these people they're building a school, but we don't want a school. We've got enough schools. What we need is more buses. You know? So that is really important. But it doesn't help you understand what works.
Yeah, but I think like the most important answer was both, and that it's also, and I think that's a takeaway for me, is that you have to look at the different methods, at different kinds of data, at different kinds of evidence, and also talking to grantees and actual people, and using this different kind of sources in producing your grant making strategy. Because I think there's a certain way that very often, like you very much talk about like randomized controlled trials as a kind of a gold standard, and if you don't have that for your intervention, then it's probably not worth it. So I like your way of using different kinds of data and evidence actually to help grant makers, and in that case, that's also kind of feasible and possible, I think, for medium-sized grant makers. So I'm gonna make a shortcut because I definitely want to talk at least a couple of minutes about the second part. The first part was so interesting that we talked a little bit longer than I thought.
Yeah, so I mean, if I can stay on a bit longer and answer some of these questions in the chat if you like.
Yeah, maybe we can do that later on, or we'll find another time to.
By the way, on the royals, we found no evidence that the royals have any effect.
It's a fun reading, that paper actually.
I'll send it. I can send it around.
Maybe you can talk just a few minutes on the foundation practice rating, because I think it's an interesting information for German grant makers, that there's basically it's an initiative by grant makers from the UK, and they want to look at what data evidence is actually out there on different issues of on grant making foundations in
it's about assessing their own performance. So what we do is it's funded by 10 foundations, and we assessed 100 UK charitable grant making foundations, and we assess them all on their practice about diversity, transparency, and accountability. And so that means that we have a group of researchers, and we came up with a list of criteria in each of those 3 areas: diversity, transparency, accountability. So we have about 50 criteria in total, and some other questions, so about 90 questions altogether. And we have every foundation is researched by 2 researchers. And so we look at things like, do they say what their funding criteria are? Do they have a list of who they funded? Do they say what percentage of their applications are successful? Do they say the diversity of their staff? Do they say the diversity of their trustees? Do they publish any feedback from their grantees? Do they say what they are going to do about the feedback from their grantees? Do they give their investment policy? It's things like that. So we are assessing them. So this is very different to what I was talking about before. We are not looking at the literature, we're looking at you. So we do this assessment. So we answer 90 questions about each of 100 foundations. So we have this massive spreadsheet, and I had to double check every single thing myself. And then we come up with a rating. So we are looking at, it's a bit like if you did a degree at university. So some people get an A, and some people get a B, some people get a C, some people get a D. And I'll just see if I can show you the answers.
Yeah, and A is basically the best.
A is the best. A is the best. And they are, it's an absolute scale. It's not a relative scale. So we didn't say, okay, a quarter have to get an A and a quarter have to get a B or whatever. It's like, you know, here is the mark for getting an A, and as the graph here at the top shows the overall rating, you can see that only 3 foundations got an A overall, and a lot of people got a B overall, and then they're split, the rest are split into C and D. D is the bottom, and then, oh, it's covered by your face. And then you can see that performance, so the big finding is that performance on practice on diversity is pretty bad. Nobody gets an A on diversity, okay? And there's only 3 people get a B, and basically loads of people getting, everybody basically gets a C or a D, which contrasts with transparency is rather better, okay? And we published masses and masses of detail about this. So the big findings were, number 1, that practice on diversity is not very good. 2 is that if you have no staff, foundations that have no staff do much worse. Okay, so this is the graph. This on the, can you see this? Mm-hmm. So on the left here is foundations that have no staff, and look, 2/3 of them get a D overall, right? Whereas foundations that have more staff are not getting Ds. So there's this, to me, this massive difference between foundations that have staff who do sort of all right and who don't have staff. It's the same if you look at trustees, which is the Vorstand, and our structure is different from yours in Germany. But basically, if you don't have enough people, I think what's going on here is if you don't have enough people, then the important work isn't happening. And I know somebody put some question in the chat about spending money on research or something rather than on grants. And yes, it's important to make grants and to get money out of the door, but other things are important as well. It's important to do that effectively, and so you can have what we call a false economy, where you are saving money but on the wrong things. I should say our list of criteria, we created that list from other people's lists, so from Glass Pockets or government or whatever. And we also did a public consultation about it, and we had loads of responses from the sector. So we are pretty confident that our list is what the sector thinks is important.
Yeah, I think it's actually reading that list is a pretty good way of also self-assessing and self-assessment, and have a look on how would your foundation actually rate on those issues, whether you are that transparent or not.
So yes, we do put names on the grades to answer this question. So yes, there is a list in the report of what every foundation gets on each of the 3 areas and also overall.
Yeah. And the interesting finding, like one of the interesting findings is, like, overall the sector is pretty bad on those issues.
Yeah.
And one has to have in mind that the transparency regulations in the UK are way stricter than they are in Germany. So it's easier to actually find something out about those issues in the UK than it is in Germany. But okay, the UK sector is pretty bad on all those issues. And the interesting thing is that the 3 best foundations, they are pretty dissimilar. And I think that would be like the last question I would ask, whether you can talk about the 3 best performers.
Yeah, so they are
not just about size.
Yeah, so there was no relationship with financial size, actually. I talked about the relationship, if you don't have enough people, then you're saving money on the wrong thing. But you don't have to be rich to do well on this. The three top foundations are the Wellcome Trust, which is, I think, the biggest foundation in Europe, has 2,000 staff and £4 billion. Then the Blagrave Trust, which has about 5 staff and about £40 million, I think. And then a community foundation in the north of England, in County Durham, which is a poor bit of the north of England. And I don't know if you have community foundations, but they are completely, they're a completely different thing. Right, they have about £20 million, I think, so yeah, you don't. So we were quite relieved, actually, that it wasn't just a test, basically, of are you rich. Foundations of many sizes and many structures can do well. I should say, if you are very small or whatever, then we exempted you from some criteria, so we did not mark you on whether you give the diversity of your staff if you only have 2 staff, for example, or that you don't get marked down for that. We just remove that question, so we only ask relevant questions. So yeah, and then next year we're going to do it again, and next year we're going to do it again, and so it's completely new, this thing, because obviously we're doing it only based on public information, and so we do it without the foundation's permission and without their control.
And I think I highly recommend reading the report and using this as a in question oneself, basically, on those issues. And I think that it's a really important impulse for the whole sector. And it's really great that 10 foundations in the UEA actually said, yeah, we want to assess our sector and ourselves in these areas. It's already 10 o'clock. I just want to thank you, Caroline, for that talk. We probably could go on and on and on, but that's not unusual for our events. But thank you very much that you've been here. Probably we'll continue this conversation maybe a couple of minutes now and at another time. So thank you very much, Caroline. Everyone, please read her book and her articles. And
if you have other questions, then you can get in touch.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for that. And our call will go on Easter holiday. So in 2 weeks, there's no call, but in 4 weeks, we're going to be back at Impulse Stiften. And then we're going to talk about what's our topic in 4 weeks? Please help me out.
Learning from failures, sharing failures with each other.
It's that's good. So in 4 weeks, we're going to talk about failures in foundation work. And then thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you, everybody else. See you each other in 4 weeks again. Bye-bye.